The freeway was a roaring concrete river, choked with the metallic glint of cars packed tight, bumper to bumper, inching forward in the relentless crawl of the morning rush. It was a symphony of urban stress, the impatient blare of horns, the low growl of countless engines, the high-pitched whine of tires on asphalt. Sunlight, already surprisingly hot for early morning, beat down on the endless ribbon of vehicles, reflecting harshly off windshields and baking the air into a shimmering haze. Inside these steel and glass cocoons, 1,000 individual dramas played out. A young woman in a pristine sedan nervously tapped her fingers on the steering wheel, her eyes darting to the dashboard clock, late again for a crucial meeting. In the minivan beside her, a frazzled father attempted to mediate a squabble erupting from the back seat while simultaneously trying to sip his lukewarm coffee. Further back, a tradesman in a battered pickup truck drummed an irritable rhythm against his door, his phone pressed to his ear, arguing with a supplier. Each vehicle was an island, each driver a solitary figure, focused on their own destination, their own pressures, their own tightly wound schedule. The commute was a daily battle, a test of patience, a necessary evil endured in the pursuit of work, school, appointments, the endless demands of modern life. There was a palpable sense of urgency, of time slipping away, of being just one more anonymous cog in a vast, impersonal machine designed to move people from one point to another, with little regard for the journey itself. The air itself seemed thick with stress, a collective sigh of resignation hanging over the slow-moving tide of humanity. Suddenly, the uneasy rhythm of the commute shattered. Brake lights flared up ahead like a sudden rash, a wave of crimson cascading backward through the tightly packed lanes. The cacophony of horns intensified, no longer just impatient grumbles, but sharp, angry blasts of warning. Tires shrieked on the hot asphalt as drivers, caught off guard, slammed on their brakes, some swerving dangerously to avoid rear-ending the vehicle in front. The sluggish river of traffic ground to a jarring, chaotic halt. Angry shouts and confused murmurs rippled through the stalled vehicles. What now? Another accident? A breakdown in a critical lane? Then, the cause of the sudden mayhem became terrifyingly clear. Darting erratically between the massive, unyielding hulks of stopped cars and the few still attempting to navigate the narrowing gaps was a creature utterly out of place, a fawn. Small, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, its spotted coat a stark contrast against the black asphalt. Its spindly legs, designed for forest floors and grassy meadows, buckled and slipped on the unfamiliar, scorching surface. Its oversized ears swiveled frantically, its wide, dark eyes dilated with an almost unbearable terror. It was a tiny, bewildered life adrift in a sea of metal and danger. Separated from its mother, lost in a terrifying alien landscape of noise and speed, it was operating on pure, unadulterated panic. It made a desperate, clumsy dash towards the concrete median, only to be confronted by another wall of roaring traffic on the other side. Confused and overwhelmed, it veered back directly into the path of a lumbering semi-truck whose air brakes hissed in a desperate attempt to stop. The fawn, a fragile speck of wildness, was trapped in a deadly game of automotive roulette, its chances of survival diminishing with every terrified leap. Unit 27. Animal on I-15 northbound, vicinity of exit 42. Multiple callers, major traffic hazard, lanes blocked. The urgent call crackled over Officer Maria Sanchez's radio, cutting through the mundane chatter of morning dispatch. Sanchez, already patrolling a stretch of the same interstate a few miles south, acknowledged the call, her voice calm and professional. Unit 27, responding. She flicked on her overhead lights, their flashing blue and red instantly parting the slower traffic in the less congested lanes. She expertly navigated her patrol cruiser, weaving through the growing backup with a practiced efficiency, her siren emitting short, sharp bursts to clear a path where necessary. As she neared exit 42, the scene of utter chaos unfolded before her. Traffic was at a complete standstill in 3 lanes, drivers out of their cars gesticulating, horns still blaring intermittently. And there, in the midst of it all, was the source of the disruption, the terrified, darting fawn. Sanchez pulled her cruiser onto the narrow shoulder, her eyes quickly taking in the entire situation. She saw the bewildered animal, its sides heaving, its every movement radiating sheer panic. She saw the frustrated and in some cases frightened faces of the commuters. She saw the long line of vehicles stretching back for what looked like miles, and the ever-present danger of a secondary accident as impatient drivers further back might try risky maneuvers. Her training kicked in immediately: secure the scene, ensure public safety, remove the hazard. But as she watched the fawn make another desperate, near-fatal dash in front of a swerving SUV, a wave of something deeper than professional duty washed over her, a sharp, aching compassion for the small, trapped creature. This wasn't just a traffic obstruction, it was a life in peril, a tiny being overwhelmed by a world it couldn't comprehend. The urgency she felt was twofold: to prevent a human tragedy and to somehow, against all odds, save this lost, terrified animal. Before Officer Sanchez could formulate a plan, human nature, in its well-meaning but often misguided form, intervened. A burly truck driver, his face red with frustration from the delay, swung down from his cab. "Hey, shoo, get out of here," he yelled, waving his arms aggressively at the fawn, trying to scare it towards the shoulder. The fawn, already overwhelmed by the noise and the sheer scale of the vehicles, reacted to this new looming threat with a fresh surge of terror. It leapt sideways, directly into the path of a car whose driver, startled, swerved violently, narrowly avoiding a collision with both the fawn and the concrete barrier. Further down the line, another driver, perhaps thinking they were helping, laid on their horn in a long, aggressive blast. The ear-splitting sound sent the fawn into another panicked frenzy. It spun in a tight circle, its spindly legs scrambling for purchase on the slick asphalt, then bolted blindly back towards the center lanes, where traffic, though slowing, was still a formidable, fast-moving threat. Each human attempt to help by chasing or scaring it only amplified its fear, making its movements more erratic, more dangerous. Sanchez watched, her jaw tightening. She knew these people meant well, that their impatience was understandable. But they didn't understand animal behavior, especially that of a prey animal under extreme stress. Chasing it, yelling at it, cornering it, these were all the wrong approaches. The fawn wasn't thinking logically, it was operating on pure primal fear. Any aggressive action would only escalate its panic and increase the likelihood of a tragic outcome, either for the fawn itself or for one of the drivers trying to avoid it. She had to find a different way, a calmer, more strategic approach. Officer Sanchez keyed her mic. "Dispatch, Unit 27 on scene. We have a deer fawn, multiple lanes. Requesting additional units for traffic control further south to slow and stop approaching vehicles. And advise animal control, though I don't think we have time to wait for them." She took a deep breath, her mind working quickly. The direct, aggressive approach was clearly failing, only endangering the fawn further. She needed to create a sense of safety, or at least a less threatening path. An idea began to form, unconventional perhaps for a highway patrol officer, but born of a desperate need and a flicker of intuition. Instead of trying to directly catch or chase the terrified animal, she decided to use her most readily available tool, her patrol car. She slipped the cruiser into drive, her movements deliberate and smooth. Slowly, carefully, she began to ease her vehicle forward, not directly at the fawn, but at an angle, positioning the car to act as a mobile barrier. Her intention wasn't to corner the fawn, which would only increase its panic, but to gently limit its options, to create a kind of moving wall. By positioning her car between the Fawn and the still active lanes of traffic on one side, or the dangerous concrete median on the other, she hoped to subtly guide it, to nudge it ever so slowly towards the relative sanctuary of the upcoming off-ramp, which she could see in the distance. It was a strategy that required patience, precision, and a deep understanding that she couldn't force the animal, only influence its desperate flight. It was a gamble, a quiet attempt to impose a sliver of order on the terrifying chaos, using her vehicle not as a weapon of pursuit, but as a shield, a gentle guide. The process was excruciatingly slow, a delicate dance between a 2-ton vehicle and a terrified, unpredictable animal. Officer Sanchez drove at a crawl, rarely exceeding 5 miles per hour, her eyes darting constantly between the Fawn, her mirrors, and the road ahead. The Fawn, still skittish and highly agitated, would run a short distance ahead, its small head swiveling, then stop abruptly, confused by the massive, slowly advancing presence of the patrol car. It would then dart left or right, testing the perceived barrier. Each time, Sanchez patiently, skillfully adjusted her car's position, anticipating the Fawn's next move, gently closing off dangerous avenues while always leaving an apparent escape route in the desired direction, towards the off-ramp. Her hands were steady on the wheel, her focus absolute. It was a profound test of nerves. One sudden move from her, one unexpected burst of speed, could send the Fawn bolting into disaster. By now, other patrol cars had arrived, their flashing lights creating a more extensive safety zone further back, slowing and eventually stopping all approaching traffic. This gave Sanchez a little more breathing room, reducing the immediate threat from behind. Among the stalled commuters, the mood was beginning to shift. The initial hunks of frustration had largely died down. People were out of their cars, phones raised, no longer just filming the traffic jam, but documenting this strange, slow-motion drama. Some faces still showed impatience, but many now held expressions of a different kind: curiosity, concern, even a dawning respect for the officer's unusual but clearly methodical approach. The highway, usually a place of high-speed anonymity, had become a theater, and Officer Sanchez, with her patrol car and her unwavering patience, was the unlikely star, engaged in a slow, meticulous shepherding of a tiny, terrified life. As Officer Sanchez continued her slow, painstaking ballet with the bewildered Fawn, a subtle but palpable shift began to ripple through the long lines of stalled commuters. The initial anger and frustration, born from disrupted schedules and the perceived injustice of the delay, started to visibly dissipate. The chorus of impatient horns had fallen silent, replaced by a low murmur of voices as people, now mostly out of their vehicles, where it was safe to do so on the completely stopped sections of the freeway, watched the unusual spectacle unfold. What had begun as an annoyance was transforming into a shared, almost communal experience. People pointed, they talked quietly amongst themselves, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe, concern, and a dawning empathy for the tiny creature at the center of the drama. The Fawn, a fragile speck of wildness against the harsh concrete, had somehow managed to pierce the AI insulation of their individual commutes. Then something remarkable began to happen. Without any official direction, small acts of spontaneous cooperation started to emerge. A man in a pickup truck, seeing a gap the Fawn might dart through as Sanchez maneuvered, slowly edged his vehicle forward, effectively closing it off. Further down, a woman in an SUV began waving other cars to stay further back, reinforcing the safety zone. It wasn't organized, it wasn't coordinated by any authority, but it was a collective, unspoken agreement. This little life mattered. The freeway, usually a symbol of hurried, disconnected existence, had, for these few extraordinary moments, become a place of shared purpose. The focus had shifted from individual inconvenience to a collective hope for the Fawn's safety. The stress hadn't vanished entirely, but it was now overlaid with a surprising warmth, a sense of human connection forged in the crucible of an unexpected crisis. Officer Sanchez felt the shift in the atmosphere, a subtle easing of the collective tension. It bolstered her own resolve. The off-ramp, a gentle curve of asphalt leading towards a welcome patch of green, was now clearly in sight, perhaps only 100 yards away. The most dangerous stretch, with its multiple lanes and bewildered cross-traffic, was behind them. The Fawn, too, seemed to sense a change. Perhaps it was the sight of the trees and bushes bordering the freeway, a promise of familiar territory. Perhaps it was simply exhausted from its terrifying ordeal and was now more inclined to follow the path of least resistance that Sanchez's cruisers so patiently offered. Its panicked, erratic darts became less frequent. It still moved with a nervous, high-stepping gait, but there was a new, albeit tentative direction to its movements, towards the sloping embankment of the ramp. Sanchez continued her gentle, unwavering guidance. She never rushed it, never made a sudden move that might spook it back towards the main lanes. Her cruiser remained a steady, predictable presence, a mobile shield subtly coaxing it forward. The other officers held the traffic further back, ensuring no new vehicles could complicate this delicate final stage. The line of stopped cars, which stretched back as far as the eye could see, had transformed into an impromptu gallery of silent, hopeful spectators. Faces were pressed against windows, children were held aloft on parents' shoulders, all eyes fixed on the small brown creature and the lone patrol car shepherding it. The usual cacophony of the freeway, the roar of engines, the blare of horns, the thrum of tires, had been replaced by a hushed, almost reverent anticipation. Every small step the Fawn took towards the ramp felt like a victory, a collective breath held, then slowly released. The goal, so improbable just a short time ago, was almost within reach. With the grassy slope of the off-ramp tantalizingly close, the Fawn seemed to gather its last reserves of courage. It hesitated for a heartbeat, its ears swiveling, its delicate nostrils twitching, as if testing the air for the scent of freedom. Then, with a final, surprisingly agile burst of speed, it scrambled up the slight incline. Its hooves, unsure on the asphalt, found purchase on the softer earth. For a second, it stood silhouetted against the brighter sky at the top of the rise, a tiny, triumphant figure. Then it was gone, vanishing into the welcoming embrace of the trees and dense bushes that bordered the freeway. The moment the Fawn disappeared, the tension that had gripped the miles-long stretch of highway snapped. A spontaneous, joyous eruption broke the silence. Car horns, once symbols of frustration, now blared in a triumphant chorus. People cheered, they clapped, they waved from their car windows. A ripple of applause, genuine and heartfelt, traveled down the lines of previously stalled traffic. Officer Maria Sanchez slowly pulled her cruiser to the side of the off-ramp, switched off her flashing lights, and let out a long, deep breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. A small, weary smile touched her lips. She watched the spot where the Fawn had vanished, a profound sense of relief washing over her. She caught the eye of a truck driver who had been watching intently. He gave her a broad grin and a hearty thumbs up. Other drivers, now beginning to inch forward as traffic controllers signaled the all clear, smiled and waved as they passed her. The collective sigh of relief was almost palpable, a shared exhalation from hundreds of people who had witnessed something extraordinary. For a brief, shining moment, they had all been united by a common hope, a shared investment in one small, fragile life. The freeway, usually a place of division and stress, had become, improbably, a stage for a quiet, collective victory. With the Fawn safely vanished into the greenery, Officer Sanchez and the other responding officers quickly set about the task of untangling the massive knot of traffic. Sirens chirped briefly as patrol cars moved to open lanes, and officers on foot gestured with practiced authority, coaxing the long lines of vehicles back into motion. The concrete river, dammed for an extraordinary interlude, began to flow once more. Yet, as the engines rumbled back to life, and the familiar rhythm of the commute resumed, something was subtly different. The usual grim-faced anonymity seemed, for a time, to have lifted. As cars passed the spot where the Fawn had made its escape, drivers craned their necks, some pointing, others smiling with a shared understanding. A woman in a minivan caught Sanchez's eye and mouthed a silent thank you, her children waving enthusiastically from the back seat. A gruff-looking man in a construction van, who earlier might have been laying on his horn, simply nodded his head in a gesture of quiet respect. The delay had been significant, schedules undoubtedly thrown into disarray. But the air, instead of being thick with residual frustration, held a lingering warmth, a sense of connection forged by the shared experience. People had witnessed not just a traffic jam, but a small miracle of cooperation and compassion. The return to normalcy felt different, imbued with a quiet sense of community, a reminder that even in the midst of the daily grind, moments of unexpected grace could and did occur. The freeway was still a freeway, but for a little while, it had been something more. Later that day, long after the adrenaline of the freeway incident had subsided, Officer Maria Sanchez found herself parked on a quiet overlook, paperwork spread across her passenger seat. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and purple. Her gaze drifted to a deer crossing sign a little way down the rural road, its familiar yellow and black a stark contrast to the chaotic concrete stage of the morning's events. She leaned back, the image of the terrified fawn, its spindly legs flailing on the hot asphalt, replaying in her mind. She remembered the sheer panic in its wide, dark eyes, a primal fear that had transcended the species barrier and tugged at something deep within her. But alongside that image came another, the unexpected, almost spontaneous cooperation of the commuters. The way they had silenced their horns, the small, unasked-for gestures of help, the collective sigh of relief when the fawn had finally reached safety. It hadn't just been her actions, her training, or her patrol car that had saved the fawn. It had been something larger. For a brief, extraordinary period, the usual self-interest and impatience of the morning rush had yielded to a shared sense of empathy. The concrete river, usually a symbol of human dominance and speed, had shown a surprising capacity for compassion, adapting its relentless flow to protect one small, vulnerable life. A thoughtful smile touched Officer Sanchez's lips. The job often showed her the harsher sides of human nature, the accidents, the anger, the frustration. But today had been a reminder of the other side, of people's capacity for unexpected kindness and collective good. It was a quiet pride she felt, not just for her role in the rescue, but for the brief, shining moment when a crowd of strangers had united, however fleetingly, to shepherd a tiny, terrified creature to safety. The Freeway Fawn had not only found its way into the woods, but it had also, perhaps, nudged a few hearts a little closer to the wild and to each other.